So we're back for another episode of On Air with Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer. This is episode 26, further to episode 24 on the Moors, and this week's is titled Revenge on the High Seas, How an Alliance of Moors and Jews Avenged Their Expulsion, which is off the back of an article, very well-researched article by Phoenician Hunter. So welcome back, Phoenician Hunter.
Hello. I just want to quickly say that it isn't an official part two to the earlier one, the Moors one, but yeah, it does continue on from what we discussed in the previous podcast, More Than Meets the Eye. So it is a follow-on in terms of the timeline and what happened with the Moors and Islam and the Jews, but it isn't an official part two. Just so in case people are looking for part two and they don't find it.
That's a very, very good point. Thanks for the clarification. So
Okay.
Today's chat, we're going to build on, obviously, as you've already mentioned, the provocative, I would suggest, claims explored in your article and in our last podcast, which was More Than Meets the Eye, namely that Islam's expansion in Iberia was more like a cultural adoption rather than a military conquest. So we're going to dig deep into the theory that Judaism may have emerged from Islam in Spain. I know that's a big call, but again, I'll leave all the expert commentary to you. And as you've alluded to, based on the works of Edwin Johnson, and we're going to trace the complex and I would say often overlooked alliances between the Jews and the Moors before the rise of Christian dominance and before it reshaped that region. So from secret conversations to piracy and empire, we're going to challenge official histories and offer a radically different lens on faith, power, and identity. So let's jump straight into it.
Yeah, before we get into the details of the article, you brought up an interesting point, and it's something that we've discussed off air, and it's like there's very few original thinkers out there. Like, we were discussing the other day how, we listen to other people's podcasts, in want for a better term, conspiracy or alternative, research, and everyone just repeats the same discussions, right? The same points, the same. Now, okay, for me personally, I either attract certain people who are interested in my point of view because it's different, and it's not really my point of view because I give credit to a lot of the people that I research, like for instance, Edwin Johnson. So it's not my original thoughts, but I've picked up from obscure researchers that very few people mention. So I do get people coming to view my stuff that way, but I also get a lot of hate and pushback as well. So, I'm stuck between those two worlds. I was just going to say it's difficult to prove anything 100%, and I've mentioned that before. But Jesus, be original at least. Don't just repeat the same stuff over and over again, which most people tend to do.
I guess it's also part of this term that we use called clickbait. So if you stay on the surface, it targets a lot more of your audience, which means that they will go, okay, that's surface level stuff. I understand it. I'll like it, follow it, repost, and then move on. Whereas what you do, particularly with your articles on Substack and what we do here on this podcast, dives a lot deeper. And when you dive a lot deeper, you open up, let's call it a Pandora's box, and people become uncomfortable. And that's great. And we encourage that.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've noticed, but with all my articles, and we'll see in this one as well, they all link up with each other because the story, it's not a dead end. It makes sense. Like, so when I unravel something or I'm doing my research, I go, oh, that's why that connects to this thing, and that's why this happened a few years later. It's all connected. It's all connected because that's when you're on the right path. Because all the pieces fit together.
I guess people don't want to do the hard work. That's what I said. Nevertheless, I hope that message has resonated because, again, what we talk about in this podcast, which is off the back of your articles, does dive fairly deep into whatever rabbit hole we're going into. So back on course, let's circle back and let's continue.
Yeah. Okay, so as you pointed out, this article follows on, right, from my earlier post, More Than Meets the Eyes, right? Where, as you said, presented evidence that the inhabitants of Iberia adopted Islam and were not conquered by force or converted by, Muslim invaders. And I also found that the rise and spread of Islam, now this is important, occurred primarily within the former Phoenician Carthaginian colonies. So
Mm.
that's where it grew from. Okay. So
Okay.
this is why my point is it came from them. The doctrine came from them. So this line of research, as I mentioned, was kickstarted by Edwin Johnson's original theory. Okay. That Judaism originated in Spain as an outgrowth of Islam. That was his claim. Okay, so when I first read that, it sounded insane, right? As it would to most people hearing this for the first time,
Sure, sure.
right? But I was able to find through research that there was evidence to back up his claim. So, and we'll go through some of that today. And like I said, you just got to be a little bit more open-minded to this kind of stuff because you haven't heard it before, or most people haven't heard it before. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, you mentioned, and we've mentioned twice already, Edwin Johnson, and I'd like to read out a quote of his that you're referring to because
Yeah.
I think it sets up the discussion for today, and it goes. There, as in Iberia, about 200 years after the erection of the mosque, the rabbis, teachers of another and much smaller clan or caste of the children of Israel, began to read a somewhat different version of the biblical tradition and to give the preference to the younger son of Ibrahim, or Abraham as we know, as their ancestor. So they leaned on the Arabian tradition. They passed for Muslim in the world, but in secret, they dreamed the dreams and saw the visions of an imaginary, regal, and rabbinical past. Gradually, during the next 200 years, they formed a new people and another great dogma was launched.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unravel there. We're not going to get into the biblical side of things because, first of all, I'm not a biblical scholar and there's
Mm.
a lot to unravel. But, I can see through the words and the symbology that there's more there than meets the eye. And for instance, you mentioned Abraham or Ibrahim. The Muslims call him Ibrahim, the Jews and the Christians have Abraham, the Indians have Brahman. It all comes
Mm.
from there. It all comes, it's just old stories readapted,
Yep.
from older sources. So, and when he says the Arabian tradition, Edwin is referring to the Persian writings, as we've discussed in previous podcasts. The Persian writings like the Avesta,
Yes.
Zoroastrianism. So what I believe happened here is so they had this doctrine of an early version of Islam, and then a group or clan wanted to elevate themselves above the rest and give preference to themselves as the chosen ones. And that word chosen ones also was a word used by the Brahmins of India as well. Okay. They elevated themselves above the rest of the population. Okay. So that term comes from there. Just as an aside, so people can look that up if they want.
Okay.
So yeah, but that topic is for another time. Okay, regardless of this split, though, this is what is the important part that we're going to focus on. Regardless of this split between the Jews and the Muslims, they still maintained a close relationship, right? And lived in peace, together in peace for centuries. Now, this was maintained until the rise of Christianity, which would then banish both the Jews and the Moors at the same time from Spain. They banished both. They didn't just banish the Muslims. This is important. They banished both of them because they saw them as the one entity, okay? Now, today, when you look at the world today, Jews, it appears Jews and Muslims hate each other. They're at war, they're killing each other. This is also an important thing to realize that this was not the case for most of recorded history. If you look at history, they always lived together. They were the way you see or the way people imagine, Christians and Jews living today, in harmony
Mm.
in most of the
Mm.
Western world. That was not the case. That's a recent shift. It was the other way around. They lived with the
Mm.
Muslims for most of it. That's why, it makes sense that they were together. They were part of that same culture at one point. Okay.
Mm.
So, and a lot of this animosity and conflict between the two obviously stems from the modern state of Israel, and that I believe was one of its purposes. Okay, to create this split between those two powers that were a combined force at some point in history.
Mm.
Okay.
Well, after reading your article, and we've had
Mm,
several chats offline. What's striking to me, and doing my own research and my own observations, is how different the landscape today looks compared to most of
mm,
what we call recorded history. And I use those
yep.
words intentionally, right? So, as you've rightly pointed out, for centuries, Jews and Muslims were living side by side, right? And
Yep.
I could quote Spain, North Africa, across the Ottoman Empire, and they often
Yep.
lived together in cooperation, not conflict, right?
Yep.
So this idea, the only way I can describe it is just preposterous, that they're eternal enemies is clearly a modern day construction, as you've just
Yep.
said.
Yep.
And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my view, is I think it's shaped less by deep historical animosity and more by the geopolitical developments of the last, let's
Yep.
say, 100 years, right? Can I just maybe make one point before you respond, because I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and we're not going to go through the history of that,
No.
and obviously the clear displacement that followed, the situation in Gaza, for example, and the broader region has essentially remained unresolved, right? We see
That's the
that.
point, though. But that's the point.
Mm,
Because if you resolve something, you might get to the point of okay, burying the hatchet and then starting peaceful discourse, and then they don't want that. It
mm,
never
mm.
it must never get to that point where they can live in harmony with their neighbors. It
So
has to stay like this.
it has to say, okay, so that makes sense, because we've seen decades of,
Yeah.
blockades,
No.
sanctions, uprising, genocide, wars,
Yep.
and
Yep.
literally a shifting global alliance, which is pretty much, people have taken sides. They've hardened the narrative on all sides, right? That's indisputable. You'd be asleep if you didn't agree with
Yep.
that. But what I find is often missing from this, let's call it a mainstream framing, is any historical memory of their coexistence, right? And a very long coexistence at that, which you're going to
It's
provide
interesting,
obviously
isn't
some
it?
clarity
Because it's
around.
not, sorry, yeah, because it's not hidden from you. All you got to do is read some history books, and you'll find that they were very close at one point, you know?
That's right, and it does pain me to say this, but the present conflict it's real and it's bloody devastating. Okay,
Mm,
if you've seen any sort of footage, but it's also layered over a far more complex past, as you've rightly pointed out, one that I guess challenges the idea that these two communities were always destined to be at odds. Nevertheless, let's maybe come back on course, because we don't want to
yeah.
go off on a tangent. In reference to this close friendship, as you have written in your article, I just want to read something out, and I'd like you to respond to it. You write, 8 centuries long, Jew and Moor toiled side by side. And during all these centuries, the Jews, with some few exceptions, politically tolerated and religiously free, arose to great wealth and commercial importance, clothed honourably high political offices, and occupied a social and intellectual position never equalled in Europe before or since. I'm really intrigued to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and that quote is by a Jewish author. So, I go right to the source, because I want to see what they have to say about it. And, that's a Jewish source, like I said. So, um, yeah, when the Christians defeated the Muslims, the Moors and Jews were given the choice between baptism and expulsion. Okay,
Mm,
so and as I have said previously, Spain had been a Phoenician colony for 1,000 years or more, and
mm,
this was their original home. Okay, this is their original home. So now, when you look at Islam today, you associate it with Arabs, Africans.
mm.
What I'm trying to say is here, the original doctrine and the original Muslims and Moors were from the Phoenician colonies. Okay. So what I believe the Jews are, the Jews were, so you've got you've got Islam, right, in its early state in these Phoenician colonies. The Jews are the merchants, the merchant caste of the Phoenicians. Okay, so because not everyone, like I say, if you say Christians as you know, and an all-encompassing term, not every Christian is a merchant, right?
Right.
Right. So when I say, Phoenicians, they're not all merchants, are they? They're not, they can't all be merchants. It's a specific caste of group or families that are the merchants.
Mm.
So these merchants, I believe, are the ones that split themselves from the rest and created Judaism. Okay. So it's important to establish that.
Okay, thank you.
And that is evident by their what they do for a living, what they do for trades,
Mm.
that commercial, they're predominantly concerned with commercial and economic, you know, um, things, trades,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
This was their original home. So expulsion, and this is where, Johnson says that, Iberia is where the Jewish writings and traditions were born. Okay. So expulsion to them was brutal because that was the only home they've known,
Of
right?
course, yeah.
So yeah, so this all also makes me think, is this one of the motives and reasons why it appears that Jews are hell bent on revenge against the church and Europeans, and people bring this up how they're trying to genocide the white race, and there's always Jewish groups or articles that are written that are against white people, against Europeans. I wonder if it stems from this episode.
That's a
Okay.
great observation. Yes.
Yeah, it's nothing I've written about or found any evidence to support. It's just an idea. Okay. So, all right, back to the article. It is estimated that about 300,000 Jews left the Iberian Peninsula during the 15th and early 16th centuries. Others stayed and converted, right, to Christianity. This is what we're told. But, where later it's discovered that these Jews that converted kept their Jewish faith and customs hidden, and these became known as the conversos. So yeah, the whole topic of the conversos is an interesting one, and Jews later did the same thing in the Ottoman Empire, where they pretended to be Muslim but kept their Jewish traditions and religion secret, and I believe they called them the Donmeh. Donmeh. I'm
Hmm.
not sure. Yeah. So, it's a practice that, they've held for quite a while. And like I said, they've done it in Christian nations, they've done it in Islamic nations. And this is why it also brings me to another point that people think in the past, our ancestors were forced to convert to another religion. I mean, so why didn't that work with Jews then? They still keep, why couldn't the pagans, for instance, keep their paganism secret? That whole theory has never sat right with me. I never believed that, masses of people were forced to convert,
Yeah.
and that's something I actually touch on in my latest post. I've just released a post the other day called "To the Vicar Go the Spoils," because it is all part of this same story, and I addressed that in that article there, what I really think happened,
Right.
and just briefly because it's relevant to what we're discussing is you didn't need to convert the people. All you need to do is convert the sovereign. Okay, this is what people don't understand. You need to convert the king. So if you've got a king that's pagan, for instance, let's talk about the Vikings. All right. So all you need to do is convert the king, and they did this by economic means. If you convert to our Christianity, brotherhood, you've got access to all these trade and markets, and you can sell your wares and you'll become filthy rich. The king's like, all right. Then the people just follow what the king believes.
Right.
That's how that's how it happens. Okay.
Yeah. And I guess, and you're right. And I guess these conversos, as you've termed them in your article, I guess they're a key part of this, let's call it a forgotten history, right? And just for our listeners' benefit, conversos, as a definition, or what we know of them, were Jews who outwardly converted to Christianity, but often kept their traditions alive. But, and here's the kicker, they did it in secret, and they pretty much lived between worlds. So
Yeah.
they were never fully trusted by the church, and they were cut off from their own community, which is a pretty dire situation to be in, right?
Well, they say that they're converted from their own
Mm,
community.
mm.
I think that there was, so if they've kept their old religion, that means they're not fully on board with the new religion that's been thrust upon them. So that means they would have kept their motives secret as well. So
Right.
this is why you find a lot of conversos, they say, brought down the Ottoman Empire and created the new state of Turkey.
Mm, mm, mm.
Okay, they were behind that. Okay, so now this brings me on to the Jesuits because a lot of Jesuit generals and leaders were of Jewish origin and they were conversos. So, when people say, oh, the Catholic Church runs the world, it's the Vatican, it's the Jesuits. Okay, but if a lot of them were conversos, maybe perhaps you have to entertain the idea that it was Jews secretly going into that organization to
Mm.
bring down the church from within. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah. And I
as they
guess,
did in the Ottoman Empire.
yeah.
Okay.
So I guess what this says to me is how people's identities at the time were, I guess, manipulated, if for the use of a better word, for survival, not for ideology, right? And that long history of, I don't know, forced division, makes today's framing or today's narrative of Jews and Muslims as natural enemies, rather, feel not only recent but misleading, and that to me is very concerning.
I might address that as we move forward. But so these expelled Jews, what happened was they would eventually settle in the territories of the Ottoman Empire. And they were, North Africa and what were called the Barbary states at that time. And what we found was that the Muslim sultans welcomed the Jews with open arms as if they were, brothers and Suleiman the Magnificent said, this is a quote attributed to him, is you call him king who impoverishes his states to enrich mine, and the Jews have been thrown out of Castile, which is Spain, which has thrown away wealth. So he understood and appreciated the value of having these Jewish merchants and their vast wealth, and he was embracing that and saying, okay, if you don't want their wealth, I'm happy to take it.
Mm.
And this caused the Ottoman Empire to flourish, and it entered into what is known as the Ottoman Empire's golden age.
Well, it's kind of fascinating to me when you look at, if you talk about Suleiman, how he responded, not with fear and aggression,
No.
but with strategy, right? So, from my viewpoint, he sort of witnessed this expulsion of the Jews from Spain, not as a crisis, but more as an opportunity.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly. Yeah,
and
exactly.
it kind of paid off, didn't it? Right. So again, a little bit of history. If again, this is what I've learned from reading your works, is that under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire didn't just expand territorially; it sort of flourished culturally, economically, administratively, and I think historians often call this the classical age, where we saw advances in architecture, trade, law, and the arts, right? And that, and a big part of that came from, I don't know, let's say absorbing talent, knowledge, networks from
Yes.
external.
Yes.
So, what I understood reading your article is that the Jewish merchants who arrived, they bought more than just wealth, okay, which is what the current narrative states. They bought access to trade routes, languages, financial systems, intellectual capital, in fact. And Suleiman, he obviously understood that a strong empire, to create a strong empire, isn't necessarily built just by purging differences, but by accepting
Or
them, by
by
harnessing,
force.
or by force,
Yeah.
but by harnessing them, right?
And by economics.
And economic expansion. And that's something that's, I think, worth reflecting on today.
So now, when you describe those instruments that the Jewish merchants brought in, the financial systems, the languages, trade routes. Who had those before? It was the Phoenicians. This
Mm,
is why this is just more evidence that I say that they were just the same people,
mm,
and they had the same networks, they were the same families, and they just created Judaism their new enterprise, okay, for want of a better term, their new enterprise.
mm.
So yeah, that all makes sense. Like again, it all fits in. Yeah, these people, these Jews didn't start from nothing and just had all this access to all this stuff. It's like, oh,
That's
all
right.
of a sudden we've got access to all the, trade routes. We've got access to all the financial instruments.
Mm,
We've got, no, it was inherited from their ancestors, which were the Phoenicians.
mm.
They had trade routes running through the whole known world, the east, all the way to the east, all the way to the west. So, yeah, now this is also a very important time in history because a lot's going on here, okay? So, I believe this is the period that there's a new program, a new reset, and this new program was Christianity,
No.
okay? Yeah, so this all happens, right? Now, I'll just go through a few points that happen. Okay, beginning in the 1450s. Okay, so this is just like 50 years before the expulsion. Okay, so the Christian armies are on the march. They're getting rid of all the Muslims in Spain at this point. We have the invention of the printing press at this time, which is, we've spoken about how important the printing press was.
Mm.
Just think of the world without the internet. That might, then
That's
you sort of understand the importance of it.
yeah.
And this is also when you receive the first printed Bible, the Latin Vulgate Bible. So that represents the new law. Okay, so the new law. This is how we're going to run things from now on. There, 1940s. Sorry, 1450s.
1450s, yeah. Yeah.
This is how we're going to run. This is a new program, everyone. Now, so then in 1453, only 3 years later, okay, so around the time that the Bible was written,
Mm.
it's the fall of Constantinople, or the fall of what a lot of people say, the old Roman Empire,
Mm.
to who? The Ottoman Turks. So
Yeah.
now Islam was very powerful to take down the Roman Empire. Even if the power of the Roman Empire wasn't what it once was, it's still symbolic for the West.
Of course.
Okay, they've taken it, they've made it Islamic. Okay, so then, like I said, 40 years later, in 1492, we have the expulsion of the Jews and the Moors from Spain. And at the same time, what do we have? The discovery of the America. Okay, now I've spoken
Or
about
the
that.
founding of America.
Yeah. So, the rediscovery, let's put it.
That's right. That's yeah.
And we've discussed that before with the
Yes.
Genoese, and the Genoese were all in Spain at this time. So,
Mm.
this is all happening. There's so much going on. Now, this is followed by, again, the Protestant Reformation in 1517. So not long, like 20 years later, people aren't happy with the Roman Bible. They want to change what it means and its purpose. It's soon after. Okay. Now, this is another thing that makes me more evidence that, behind the fact that it was written at this time, because Orthodox Christians say that the Bible was written, 2000 years ago or whatever, 1,000 years before this period. Are you telling me that it took 1,000 years for people to start ifing and ahhing about it
Mm.
and saying, oh, maybe this isn't the right approach? No, it happened instantly, as it would. You're not going to wait 1,000 years and say, ugh, no, I don't agree with that. So again, it all happens at this time. So, and again, the Protestant Reformation, I think, had to do with the Venetians in alliance with the Jews, sort of getting back, sort of fighting back at this, this Catholic version of Christianity. So again, during this same period, we have the spread of the Renaissance as well across
Mm.
Europe, the rise and expansion, like you said, of the Ottoman Empire, and also the influence of the Jesuit order, which is born in 1540.
Right.
Again, with many Jewish conversos as members, like the second in command which was called, his name was Diego Lainez.
Yes.
So these are very important events, world-changing events, and they all happen within a century. So this is why I believe this is a reset. This is a very important time when they're resetting everything, and people are fighting for it. So you got the Jews fighting the Protestants, the Catholics, Islam, they're taking the Roman Empire. So there's a lot of power shifts.
What's striking to me, further to what you've just mentioned, is how
Yeah.
many of those foundational shifts happened in such a short window,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Political, religious, technological, cultural, right? And right in the middle of all that, you get the formation of the Jesuit order, as you've
Yeah.
said. So, so my knowledge about Diego Lainez is that he was one of what they called the original seven who founded the Society of Jesus with, I think it was Ignatius of Loyola. Not quite sure.
Yep.
I think I might be right. He, in fact, was a converso, and correct me if I'm wrong. And that kind of matters, doesn't it? It shows how fluid identities were, I guess, beneath the surface, even with institutions that later defined orthodoxy. So, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the Jesuits weren't just a religious order, right? They kind of became an intellectual shock troop for the church. They ran universities, they advised monarchs, they shaped doctrine. And we see this today. And having somebody like Lainez, as you've mentioned, in that inner circle, kind of suggests to me, if I've interpreted this correctly, that even as Europe was, let's say, drawing hard lines between faiths, the people inside those lines weren't always who they appeared to be. And I guess that tension between, I guess, the surface-based loyalty and hidden roots is kind of a pattern we keep seeing across this period. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's prudent to remind listeners that the Jesuit order was really brought into existence as a response to the Protestant Reformation. That was like you said, their shock troops and almost like their secret service.
Mm.
The way Venice had their Council of Ten, it operated very similar. And we've mentioned this in previous. If people want to know more about that, just look up the Protestant Reformation,
Mm.
the Phantom Menace, I believe we've called it. So
Yep,
they
yep.
can go and check that out. So yeah, they were shaping things behind the scenes, and fighting a Cold War, right? It's probably the best way to put it. They're all fighting
Mm-hmm.
the Cold War, not a hot war against what all these changes that are happening at that time. So yeah, to go back to the article, to some extent, this period between the 1400s and 1600s, I believe, is still part of the Crusades. Okay, so it's still this. Or as Edwin Johnson puts it, it's wars between East and West, okay? Not for faith, but for the rule of the world, okay? They're still fighting for the rule of the world. Islam is still powerful. And people forget, up until only a few hundred years ago, Islam was a world power, right? A world power. And I believe one of the reasons Israel, and I mentioned this before, was created by the West, all right? It was created by the West, British influence and money and American might as well, was to keep that part of the Islamic world subdued.
Yes, makes sense. Yep, yep.
And that's why we mentioned earlier that it can never have peace. It can't. It has to always be in conflict and that because they do, up until this point, they did fear Islam. Okay.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
That during Suleiman's reign, and again, you mentioned it between 1520 and 1566, you write in your article that the Ottoman state became the number one world power that included most of the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Europe, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So under Suleiman, huge territories of North Africa, which were known as the Barbary states, became provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So they were under their control, right?
Mhm.
So from these states, Barbary states, an alliance of Moors and Jews would launch the largest, ever coordinated pirate attack upon Christendom. And it is estimated that between 1530 to the late 1700s, 1780, millions of people from Europe were enslaved. Okay,
Mhm.
that's a long period to
Yeah,
be
of course.
coordinating these attacks. Okay, hundreds of years that the Europeans were not able to stop them. That's how powerful Islam was.
Mm.
So like 18, we're up to the 1800s. Okay, it's not
Mm.
long ago. Now, it was the United States which finally put an end to these pirates, okay, only in 1815,
Mm.
200 years ago. and that is known as the Barbary Wars. It's a very interesting conflict, and that really brings it up to the modern era.
Mm,
Okay, so if you think about, these Muslims from North Africa attacking Europe constantly,
mm.
only 200 years ago.
Well,
Okay,
yeah.
no, it just puts it into perspective how much of a threat Europe saw Islam.
Yeah, well, in your article, and again, I think this is quite timely, you quote a Jewish author, and I'm not sure who the author is. Having read your article a few times, I feel that it probably captures a pivotal moment when these Sephardic Jewish exiles and their Muslim hosts in North Africa, they forged a powerful economic and military alliance, right? And the quote goes
Yeah,
like this, and maybe you can talk to the quote. When the Sephardic exiles arrived in North Africa, they were consigned special quarters by their Muslim hosts. Together, the two exiled immigrant groups forged a formidable force. Sephardic merchants financed the Moors, devastating raids on the on the coastal towns rather of Spain and Italy, and shared the rewards.
yeah,
Spices from the east, as we know, and more importantly, Christian slaves from Europe.
yeah. So yeah, at this time, the only European safe haven for Jews was Holland. So now this brings us to another interesting point in history, and what I said earlier, how it all connects. All these pieces connect to what's going on, a few centuries later, and you see this picture emerging. So in Holland is where the Jews are said they could practice their religion in peace. So now Holland at this time becomes a Protestant nation. So they flock to either the Islamic nations or Protestant nations. Okay, and this is where Holland becomes almost the new financial capital of Europe, and there's new financial institutions that are developed there, and like the birth of the Dutch East India Company that others emulate later and copy. There was I believe the first stock exchange is developed at this point. So again, it's these Jewish merchants that are creating these financial instruments. It's not the Europeans, it's not the Dutch that are doing it. Okay, so now I found that the head of the Ottoman Navy at this point was Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
But it was in fact his second in command, who was a Jewish sailor called Sinan Reis, who led most of the sea battles because Barbarossa was more concerned with strategy, plotting the moves, but the actual battles were led by this Jewish sailor. So yeah, it just goes to show the alliance and how they trusted each other, and how important the Jews were to the Muslims at this point.
And I guess part of that story often gets overlooked in the current narrative, but I guess we need to understand that it's so important when you're tracing, you're looking at the history of how power shifted during this period, right?
Mm,
And I'm not sure, I can't recall whether you've gone into the detail of Barbarossa, but he wasn't just a pirate, right? And again, I did a bit of research before this
mm,
podcast, and, he was referred to as the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet and one of the most feared naval commanders in the Mediterranean at the
yeah,
time. And under his leadership, we're told that the Ottomans literally dominated the sea.
yep,
They challenged Europe to take control at the time when maritime trade, and you've gone into this through many of your articles, was essentially becoming the new backbone of the empire, right? But what's kind of intriguing to me is his second in command, who you've mentioned, Sinai Rice, Reis, for those that want to do some more research on him.
mm,
He was referred to as the famous Jewish pirate or the Great Jew. That's how he was known at the time.
yeah,
And he
yep,
wasn't. It wasn't just a token naming, or he wasn't just a token figure. And we need to be clear about this. And again, I'd like your thoughts. Further. He played, from my understanding, he played a key role in leading these naval campaigns, particularly against Spanish and Italian forces, and he was very instrumental in coordinating the attacks that disrupted Catholic shipping routes, right? And please step in anywhere if I'm wrong here,
Yeah,
but
see, again, it's predominantly Catholic, not Protestant, to remember that they were going after. Okay.
yeah, and they weren't these
Sorry,
right.
because I believe that Protestantism was spearheaded by an alliance between, Jews
Yeah.
and the Venetians, because that created a safe haven for them within Christian nations. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why they would back that.
Yeah, and a lot
Yeah.
of these raids, as you've rightly mentioned, weren't just about money. They were part of what we see as a larger geopolitical push to, I guess, weaken Christian Europe's grip on trade and coastal security,
Yeah.
right?
Predominantly Catholic.
Okay. Probably
Yep.
Catholic, right? So if I was to
Yep.
sit back and reflect on all this, right, the
Yeah.
fact that a Jewish convert or converso,
Yep.
as you've
Yep.
mentioned, and as you pointed out earlier, could rise to that level of influence within the Ottoman military, kind of says a lot about the flexibility of identity and power at the time, right? So, especially when when it's compared to the rigid exclusion that the Jews faced across much of Christian Europe at the time.
Yeah, I think that's a myth too. To
Right.
say
Okay.
like that, they say, "Oh, we were excluded. We were this. We were second-class citizens." That's just one of their, victimhood status cards they like to play
Right.
continually. They weren't. They had a lot of influence. They were in powerful positions, even under Catholic nations too.
Mm.
They were given roles within the Catholic Church as money lenders and that as well. So don't give me, whenever they play this victim card, it's the complete opposite.
Of course. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Okay, so now I want to go back to just something that I heard that it might be true, might not, but it's interesting anyway for listeners, is that the skull and crossbones
Mm. Mm.
that is associated with the pirate flags
Yes.
was, if you break that apart symbolically, it's the bones are in the shape of a cross, okay?
Mm.
And the skull represents death. So it's death to the church,
Right.
death to
Okay.
Christianity,
Yep.
okay? And they were going after predominantly, like I said, Catholic ships at the time.
Mm.
So just something there that might be of interest.
That's extremely interesting, actually.
Yeah. So going back to Barbarossa, so his flag provides another clue to this alliance between the Muslims and the Jews. And on the flag, there is a six-pointed star. Okay,
Mm.
so he's flying this six-pointed star. Now, what people need to realize at this time, there was no Star of David. Okay,
Mm.
Star of David is a new adopted symbol for Judaism. It was never historically part of that faith. Okay, so at this time, when you're seeing that six-pointed star, it's Islamic. We are told that it was is an Islamic symbol known as the Seal of Solomon. And now it goes back to that Solomon character was, and Edwin Johnson brings this up, that it was associated with Islam, not Judaism. Judaism adopted it later. Okay.
Mm.
Okay, so today, as it's known as the Star of David, but it was not of Jewish origin and seems to have again been borrowed from their Muslim brothers, like a lot of their doctrine. And like I said, it was born out of Islam in Iberia, and that's where they created that offshoot Judaism. So all this evidence just gives weight to that theory, that ridiculous, outlandish theory of Edwin Johnson's that that Judaism came out of Islam. But when you see all these little signs of little nuggets of evidence, it does paint a bigger picture, and that he's correct.
And I think your insight into Barbarossa's or the piracy flag is it's more than symbolic, okay? And
Yeah.
it to me it challenges a lot of assumptions about historical identity. I've done a bit of research on this Star of David, as you mentioned it, and I want to maybe
Yeah.
put something to you and get your feedback on. But my understanding is that, as you've said, the six-pointed star, as everyone refers to it today, as the Star of David, right? As you've just rightly pointed out, it wasn't always tied to Jewish identity. In fact, and this is where I love, diving a little bit deeper, and this is probably going to shock and maybe perhaps even anger some of our listeners, but again, this is what history, what the historical books and the ancient texts tells us is that, you've just mentioned it. It was widely used in, Islamic cultures as the Seal of Solomon, which you've just said, right? And that was associated with wisdom and protection. And, for those that are listening to this podcast and think that, we're a couple of nut job anti-Semites, well, I've got to tell you right now, you're mistaken. And please, I'd be interested in people's feedback. But I encourage people, and you do as well, to do their own research, and they'll see that on Ottoman banners, on architecture, and even Barbarossa's naval flag, that you'll see this, let's call it the Seal of Solomon rather than the Star of David. So it wasn't until probably the late 1800s, further to what you've just mentioned, and what is now known as the First Zionist Congress, which was led by this guy called Theodor Herzl, that the star was actually formally adopted as a Jewish symbol, right? 1897. That's recent.
Yeah, and I also believe that that was all done as I said earlier to create this divide and conflict in the Middle East. It's almost to shit on Islam and to get them upset.
Exactly.
You've taken all our things, and yeah. In my article, I found that in 1973, construction workers in Tel Aviv discovered the Star of David on a 1,200-year-old mosaic
Okay,
floor.
there you go.
And then they were saying, oh, but the thing is, the floor wasn't Jewish; it was Muslim. You see, so that goes back again. Edwin Johnson assertion that Islam was first and is older than Judaism. And this is a statement he makes. He says Muslims were the true authors of the tradition about David and Solomon. Now the evidence backs him up. Okay, so from here, the Jewish pirates would eventually turn their attention towards the New World. So, after the Jews had, with the alliance with the Muslims had devastated Europe, they turned their attention to the New World. Okay, so now this is why I believe that they've sort of starting to leave their Muslim hosts now. They've used them. They don't really need them now. They use them to weaken the Catholic Church. Now they've moved to where? Now they moved to, the Dutch, to Holland and to England and to the Protestant nations. And now they join forces with the Dutch and British to do what? To attack the Spanish and Portuguese and Catholic ships in the New World. Okay? So this again brings up the link with the Protestant Reformation and the Venetians and the Genoese and their activities in Iberia and Holland and England and all that story. See, we've moved into this new timeline, which I've discussed in other articles. So this is an important period. And again, another shift. Now it brings the story into the modern era. Okay, so new alliances are forged. Okay, now, this is the other thing. The alliances don't have to stay the same forever. Yeah. Okay, they shift. And this is, I have arguments with people who believe, someone said to me, oh, England is owned by the Vatican because there was a treaty in 1200 that they signed and the Vatican owns it. So from 1200, nothing else happened. It's like, I said, oh, what happened to all the wars and the power shifts? Oh, they were all fake. I don't know where to go from that with people. So no, it's clearly seen here that the Jews now are moving away from Islam and creating this new alliance with predominantly Protestant nations, especially England. And this is where you see England rising in power. It's becoming an empire with the help of these merchants.
Well, to me, what we've just touched on raises a pretty important, but I think a very serious question. How many other things, we think of as fixed or ancient are actually modern day inventions? Symbols like identities. Yeah. They're often shaped by politics and circumstances, not by historical continuity, right? But there's another quote in your article which I feel is pretty relevant here, and it goes along the lines of, perhaps the most famous or most successful of all the Jewish pirates in the Caribbean was Moses Cohen Enriquez. Enriquez joined forces with the Dutch admiral Pieter Zoon Hein to pull off an enormous heist on a Spanish treasure fleet, netting what would be nearly $1 billion in today's currency, right?
Yeah.
And the theft nearly bankrupted Spain and caused a rise in silver prices around the world.
Yeah. And again, another Jewish pirate. See, when I looked into pirates early on, no one mentioned Jewish people as being pirates. I thought it was predominantly English, but the more you look into it, you discover what's hidden beneath the surface. Yeah, I mean, see, the ultimate goal of the Jews and the Moor alliance was to bring down the Spanish Empire and to exert revenge. And then later, the Jews shifted. After they exhausted the Muslim power, they went and made an alliance with the Dutch and the English, and to bring down again, to exert this revenge on Spain. And eventually Spain lost all its American colonies, and that's where we are today. So, yeah.
Well, it's certainly a complex legacy. And I guess when you follow the threads from the fall of Andalusia to the rise of these global empires, you really start to notice how, how that desire for retribution, it may have kind of quietly influenced the course of history, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's where we're at. And that's why this conflict in the Middle East, it sort of brings it up to now you sort of got a little bit of a background and understand it maybe a little bit better,
Well, look, I think that's been a great discussion. I think we've taken up enough time. This sort of wraps up what I would call, and I might sound like a broken record here, but another fascinating chat. It certainly opened my eyes to a lot of the current narrative and how a lot of it's been manipulated. But again, another big thanks to you, Phoenician Hunter, for unpacking these sorts of hidden histories. You can call them overlooked connections, and I guess the deeper cultural meanings that we kind of stop to consider because we just take what's given to us as being the narrative. Before I get you to come in, I'd like you to leave us with your final thoughts. Based on everything that we've discussed today.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people read current events, geopolitical events on the news, and then they've given it like a sort of a brief history lesson on Israel and Muslims, and they think they understand it. No, you just understand, like you said, the modern overlay, what you're being told and what you're being given as propaganda. You don't understand the full history, where it stems from. This is an old story. And what you see today is, the outcome of all this development that has occurred in the last couple of 100 years. Okay, like I said, from the moment the Jews and the Muslims are expelled from the old Phoenician colony, I'm going to call it that, and then you can see that all the activities that come out of that, all the wars, all the political shifts, the religious movements, the Jesuits, the conversos, everything, it all makes sense from that moment on to this current point that we find ourselves.
Well, again, fantastic summation. Unfortunately, this is where we're going to have to leave it for today. As always, sharp work. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
So to our listeners, if this episode got you thinking, and it really should get you questioning more than anything, then check out Phoenician Hunter's Substack. A lot of work is available free, and his tag is phoenicianhunter.substack.com. And if you haven't already, we'd be very grateful for a subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is at On Air Podcast 2025, which is all hyphenated. We've got 25 other episodes just like this, and as always, they're all free to stream anytime. So until next time, keep digging and keep asking questions. This is Phoenician Hunter and 369 Lumineer signing off.